It's Saturday morning, and you know what that means. It's Impact Discipleship. Brought to you by KEM.
You can see this is why I have Danny do that. Everybody else is like a boring birthday song. It is amazing. So, hey, welcome back. And guess where we are today? We are in the end of Colossians. Oh yeah, this is actually the 10th week. 10 weeks of Colossians. How odd. So it took us 9 weeks to do 3 chapters, and it's going to take us 1 week to do the whole 4th chapter. And the reason it's not going to take that long is because this chapter is filled with salutations and names of people that Paul wants those he's writing to remember. Say hi to so-and-so, I'm sending you that guy, and so on. And we'll talk about who they are in the Bible. Some of these characters have very little said about them in the Bible, some of them more. But Colossians 4 has 18 verses, and I would like whoever's going to read first, Josh, if you would read the first 6 verses. And we'll call this whole thing, this section right here, Final Instructions. But the title of the message is called Seasoned with Salt, and you'll see why shortly.
Does 4 start with masters or continue?
Masters, okay. Yes, it is. It's right. It continues from the chapter before, right? Yeah, masters.
Okay. Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us that God would open up to us a door for the word, to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one.
You hear that, seasoned with salt? That's where I got the title. That really caught my attention. It's interesting, Josh, how you said, hey, did we start with continue or masters? It's weird how it's been broken up in a lot of these Bible versions, but that verse goes better with the end of the last chapter, right? Masters, it says, masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. The last verses of the last chapter, chapter 3, says, bondservants, obey your masters, according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but sincerity of heart. And then it's how the master treats the servant. You would think that would be at the end of the last chapter. I'm not really sure how it got divided up. But the idea here about how masters are to treat their bondservants is the idea of how you're thinking about how God would treat you. The reality is that we are all bondservants, and we can have expectations of how God can treat us. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And the expectation is, because of the rule is do unto others as you want them to do to you, right? And God lives by that rule. He wants to treat you the way he wants to be treated. He wants to treat you justly and fairly the way you're supposed to consider God. That's what it's about. And it really would have been better served to connect this to last week, but as it is, that's how it's been broken up. As we continue, in the verse that Josh picked up, probably should have been in the beginning of this chapter, he says, continue earnestly in prayer and be vigilant in thanks. And basically that you're praying for us that the doors would be open. Because remember, Paul has spent his entire life traveling around in ministry, and he goes to cities where the doors are wide open to receive truth about the gospel, and other places that shut in his face, and he gets tossed away or persecuted. And then he says this, for the word which I'm speaking is about the mystery of Christ. Now that's something for, let's say novices in the Bible, or maybe somebody who's never learned certain things about the Bible. What is that mystery of Christ? For us who have been studying through Colossians for 9 previous weeks, we spent a lot of time talking about that because this letter has a foundation in that in the beginning of the letter. I'll remind you of that in a moment. And then he says this, for which I'm also in chains, that I may make manifest everything I'm going to speak about. So it's an important thing to understand that Paul is writing this letter from prison. He's writing this letter from jail, much like Peter was writing his second letter before the end of his life from prison. And we'll talk about that. So, be vigilant and thankful in prayer. James wrote, the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. What does it mean? What does it mean to be vigilant? It means to be on guard, watching. Why? Because he wants you to do something. He wants you to do something. The thing he wants you to do is the very thing that put Paul in prison. Who wants to sign up for that? He wants you to do what put him in prison. And so Paul was in Rome in prison at the end of his life. Paul was in prison at the end of his life in Rome, and he was awaiting his trial, ironically, that he asked for. Now, we can't go into all the whole details of why that happened, but here's the layout. He starts getting accused of all sorts of things, bad things, in the book of Acts, chapter 21. He spends the next 9 years of his life defending himself, and the thing that he's trying to do is get the truth out, and the only thing he can do to keep going without being killed in every city is he appeals to Caesar. Now, why was he able to do that? Because he was a Roman citizen. So he's like, listen, you're not allowed to do this without a trial. This is all bogus. I appeal to Caesar. And ironically enough, years earlier in his life, he says, I got to do anything. Be careful of what you wish for, Danny. He says, I'll do anything I need to do, but I got to get to Rome. And God's like, oh, you're going to get to Rome. It's not going to be the way you want. You're going to be carried there in chains. And he winds up in Rome. And he's writing this letter to the Colossians from Rome. And that's what we have in our hands today, the outcome, right? And his thing is, here's what he wants to say to you. Something that can be very practical to you today as a Christian, as a believer in Yeshua, Jesus. No matter what happens or will happen, be thankful. Colossians, be thankful. I'm thankful even though I'm in prison writing you this letter. That's pretty heavy, right? And what does it mean to open the doors to speak the mysteries of Christ? I think for you, if you haven't been with us, if you're watching online, and you say, well, I don't know what that means, there's a teaching called In Him, in You, Part 4. There were 4 parts to the first part of this letter. And this was called Christ in You, the Hope of Glory. It's coming from the end of chapter 1, and verses 27 to 29 says this. To them, God willed to make known what are the riches of the glory, and here it is, of the mysteries of the Gentiles, which is, here's the mysteries of the Gentiles, Christ in you, the hope of glory. Then he says, him we preach, warning every man and teaching every man, that we may present every man perfect in Christ Jesus. To this end, I also labor in vain, a labor striving according to his working. What does this even mean? Paul is a scholar. He knows the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, backwards and forwards. There was no mystery to Judaism that the Messiah of Israel was supposed to be for the Gentiles also. That's not a mystery. It's everywhere throughout the Torah and the prophets. Israel was supposed to evangelize the world with the message of there's only one God. They were supposed to do that. That's not news. Now, in the first century, you could argue that it was a little bit of news because they had become so religious and so disconnected from the truth that they couldn't see the very Messiah that God had promised, right? But what he didn't understand until he got alone with God, for what we know in Paul's life after he has his conversion, for 14 years he's wrestling with God on these matters, and what he came to realize is this. The thing that was kind of new, and the thing that was new, the understanding that was new, was that God, and Christians know this today, God's intention was to inhabit the human heart. Not just a relationship with God like, oh, there's God out there, you're God, I worship you, but God in here. God's intention was to transform you from the inside, Christ in you. Not about Christ, not knowing about him. And that's why marriage is the quintessential example of Christ in the church, because marriage is the most intimate relationship in the world where a husband and wife are in one another. It's not a next to one another, it's an in one another. That's why sexual intercourse is only for married people. It's not just, sex outside of marriage. Is that really wrong? Yes, wrong, completely wrong. Because it's so intimate that it's supposed to mimic in you. Christ in you is a marital relationship of such intimacy that you are literally manifesting God from the inside out. That's kind of new in concept to the first century Jews. They don't have that concept. So that's the mystery. And it's a mystery because the Bible's filled with mysteries that God has charged man to figure out. And Paul's one of these mystery finders, and he's assigned us to do the same. So Christ in you, the hope of glory, is this: the perfection of God is manifesting in humans. And that's what he was talking about in that first chapter when he's originally writing this letter. So then he goes on in this fourth chapter, walk in wisdom towards those who are on the outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer. I have to say, this is verse 5 and 6. If there's any theologically dense teaching, it's just really here, sitting right here. So we're going to unwrap this. Hopefully I'll make it understandable. Walk in wisdom as you witness to non-believers who are looking on. That's what it means. Walk in wisdom to those who are on the outside. The world is looking at you. Walk in wisdom. Then it says this, redeeming the time. So people are watching. And I like to say it this way. Pastor Manny said this from the pulpit a few weeks ago. I've repeated it a few times. It wasn't his quote. He was quoting a quote. But it's you may be the only gospel anyone ever reads. And I remember when I first opened my chiropractic practice 20 plus years ago here in South Florida, I remember thinking, and it was practice was so close to a mega church, and I had so many Christian patients, and I used to leave the office almost every day and come home to my wife and say, I meet so many new Christians, I would never know they were Christians if they didn't tell me. There was nothing about their life or the conversation I had with them in the office as I was interviewing them that would make me think they were any different than anyone. And I thought to myself, wow, that's not good, right? Our life should exude the love of Christ to the point where people know there's something different. You should walk in this home and go, there's something going on here. There's something different here before somebody says a word. So he says, listen, live your life in such a way that people on the outside will notice something different. Then he says, redeem the time. This is a section of a verse that really strikes home for me. And I'd like you to see this in two perspectives. Perspective number one, broad scope, prophetic. It's important to recognize God's prophetic calendar. You don't have time to waste. God's doing things in the earth. You need to pay attention to it. There's a calendar of events. Paul knows this well because he's raised as a religious educated Torah scholar, religious Jew. He understands the feast cycles. He understands the patterns. He understands prophetically what they mean. And you have to be paying attention to the prophetic time clock. That's number one. Prophetic, big picture. Then there's the pastoral side. What does it mean to you, you personally? What's the personal side to this? And the personal side is that we all have the same amount of time every day. We all have the same amount of time every week. We have 24 hours a day, 168 hours a week, 720 hours each month, and 8,736 hours every year. If you're rich or poor, male or female, if you have a good job or a bad job, if you live in the United States, you live in Russia, you live in Israel, it doesn't matter where you are, who you are, where you're from, what you do, you all have the same economy of time. And the question for you is, what are you doing with it? And I do this when I do personal coaching and counseling and so on, but I've included, if you're listening to this online, or you guys after this, you'll find this teaching online, you'll find the notes for this teaching online, and at the end of those notes, there's a time priority worksheet sitting there where you can do an inventory of your life. What am I spending my time doing? You all have to sleep, you all have to eat, you all have to take personal care of yourself. Some of you are students also, you're going to school, you're studying. And there's the essentials. There's things that are going to be in your life no matter what. And then there's all the extra time. All the time that's discretionary. God says redeem that time. Don't waste that time. If you find yourself with flicking social media and inundated with entertainment and you're missing the greater things you can be doing with your time. On that worksheet, I even calculate the amount of hours it takes to earn a doctorate. The average person, by the way, it takes 7 to 8 years to earn a doctorate, right? The average person can earn a doctorate at the same time they're doing everything else in their life, working full-time, raising a family, You have enough extra time to earn a doctorate in 7 or 8 years if you're not wasting time. You could live a life, full-time work, and still have enough time for the school necessary to earn a doctorate. And so when we think of ourselves, oh, I'm a full-time student. What do you do? I'm a full-time student. No, a full-time student means you're working part-time. You could work full-time, go to school full-time, and raise a family, and still have enough time in 168 hours a week. If you're doing what? Not wasting time. So Paul says, redeem the time. Then he says this, very powerful. Let your speech always be, Josh, this is the reason I text you this morning, because of our conversation last night. Right? About what you're getting about the words, right? How powerful the words are. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you know what you ought to answer. This is so powerful. When you think of words of grace, I think of Ephesians 4:29. That's another letter Paul wrote, obviously to a different city. This he wrote to Ephesus. Ephesus is a city he spent lots of time in, a number of years on his ministry endeavors. Colossae, never. They're not far from each other. They're about 100 miles apart on the map. But he never went to Colossae, not that it's recorded. But this is what he said in Ephesians 4:29. He said, let no corrupt word come out of your mouth, but what is necessary for edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. Now that sounds nice. No big deal. Until you understand what God's grace is. God's grace is supernatural empowerment. God's grace is God's power. God's grace is God's coverage. God's grace, I was talking to a young person today, and some of you have heard me say this, but if your life is a piece of toast, and you examine that piece of toast, it's filled with defects, right? It's got divots and nooks and crannies, as they say growing up with English muffins, right? It has spaces that are empty and broken parts, in a sense, right? God's grace is butter. It fills in every crack. It smooths over every rough spot. There's no defects when God's grace is involved. Okay, well, that's cool, that's God. But God is saying you have the authority and responsibility to impart that grace to others. You can become a vessel through which God works, and his grace comes out of you into someone else. You can become the butter in someone's toast. And it's a responsibility and a possibility. And then that he says that your words are seasoned with salt. Why is that it has less power today when you say it, but very powerful then?
Sermon on the Mount.
Well, yeah. Salt. They don't have refrigeration. They don't, right? They have a different technology, right? It says in Luke 14, salt is good, but if salt loses its flavor or saltiness, its properties of salt, how shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for land nor dunghill, but men throw it out. He who has ears, let him hear. Right? Salt is useful because it has certain properties. It enhances flavor. You know that, right? It preserves freshness. It disinfects germs. That's important in the first century, right? They don't have refrigerators. They don't have certain means of disinfecting. Salt was it. So if it doesn't have those qualities, it's not good for anything. What is it going to be used for? Right? Now we can add some more things, right? You can use it as an emulsifier. You can use it to scrape things off your skin, right? It's what's that called? An exfoliant. Right? It has uses, but if it loses its properties, it has no use. So what is he saying? If your words are not filled with God's grace, fill in the blank, they're useless. If your words are not filled with God's grace, they're useless. They're empty. They're doing nothing. And Jesus, Yeshua said in Matthew 15, it's not what goes into a man's mouth that defiles him. It's what comes out of his mouth that defiles him. That's not saying you can eat anything you want. It's not a Torah, anti-Torah statement he's making if you read the context. Let's not get into that. But let's just say this. He's saying you have so much concern for how food is going in your mouth, but you have no concern about what comes out of your mouth. You might harm yourself by what goes in your mouth, but you harm everyone by what comes out of your mouth, right? That's what he's saying. And James said, isn't this ironic, Josh, that we were talking about this? You had no idea, right?
No, not today. But...
No. So James, Josh and I were talking after the service last night, and he's like, how do we get there? Like, if this is true, the tongue is like a member in your mouth, in your body, and it's like a spark that can light an entire forest fire. The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. It's so set among the members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. Think of the power. I mean, you guys know, anybody who's lived out west and seen forest fires, right? They literally burns thousands and thousands of acres uncontrollably. God is saying, James is saying, your tongue can light a fire and burn a city to the ground, right? And that's James chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. It goes on a few verses later in 9 and 10. It says, with it, here you go, with it we bless God the Father, and with it we curse men, who have been made in the similitude or in the likeness of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessings and curses. My brethren, these things ought not to be. See, that's the secret right there, Josh. Mm-hmm. It's that, but it ought not to be that. You get it? It's that, but it shouldn't be that. That's the secret. It's that, but it shouldn't be that. What should it be? It should be words seasoned with salt. Because the way, if man was made in the image of God, and you know that, then the words out of your mouth would be filled with grace because you want to bless the image of God, not curse it. And then, if you notice what it said, let me go back to it. He said, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Now, in this context, it's talking about people that don't even know God. Remember, those that are on the outside. And it says that you may know how to answer them. Meaning, if your words are filled with God's grace, and you're encountering pushback from a non-believing world, and you're channeling the words of God through your mouth, then you'll know exactly what to say in that moment. What did Jesus say about that? In Matthew chapter 10, he said, but when they deliver you up to the unbelievers, don't worry about what you're going to say. For it will be given to you in the hour that you should speak. For it is not you who speak, but what? But the Spirit of the Father who speaks in you. Do you see that? It goes like this. Psh, psh, down from God, through you, out of your mouth. And here's the difference. If you were doing that, can you see it now? If you were doing that, the unbelieving world would look on and say, I want what you have. That's what they would do. Nobody could resist that grace. Right? All right, so who wants to read next? You have to be willing. You have to be willing to pronounce names wrong. Who's willing to pronounce names wrong? Anybody? Keegan? Yeah, of course. Keegan will pronounce names right. Maybe. I won't even know if you don't. So
yeah, that's the beauty about it.
We're going to read Colossians chapter 4, 7 to 15.
Okay.
We're going to speed through this section because there's not a lot of theology here.
What, 14?
7 to 15.
Okay. To Chikos, who is a beloved brother, a true servant, and a fellow servant in the Lord, shall give you all the news about me. I am sending him to you for this purpose, to know your circumstances and to encourage your hearts. With Onesimus, a true and beloved brother, who is one of you. They shall let you know all the news here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, with Marcos, the relative of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Also, Yeshua, who is also called Justus. There are my only fellow workers for the reign of God, who are of the circumcision, who were to me a comfort. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Mashiach, greets you, always wrestling for you in prayers, so that you stand perfect and complete in all the desire of God. For I bear him witness that he has a deep concern for you, and for those who are in Laodicea, and those in Hierapolis. Lucas, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Greet the brothers of Laodicea and Nymphas in the assembly that is in his house. And
That's it.
Okay.
Good, thank you. Of course, Keegan did a fabulous job with his Hebrew-esque. I'm sure you recognize some of those names. Certainly you all recognize one of those names. Luke the physician.
Yeshua.
Oh, well, you sure that's not right?
Eustace.
So Luke the physician, and Danny said Mark. Now this is Mark. Yes, three names, right? And Barnabas, right? So Mark. Who's this Mark? And who's this Barnabas? You see them. They show up more in the scripture. Of course, Luke. You'll recognize that he's the writer of the Gospel of Luke. That's the person who that Luke is. So I'm just going to power through this. We're not going to spend a whole bunch of time. Tychicus, he's a servant of the Lord. He was in Colossae, which is 1,300 miles from Rome. The trip would have been full with dangers. So he's originally from Asia. And he accompanied Paul on part of his journey in Macedonia. If you were to picture, you guys, if you don't see a map, I got to do it backwards now. Okay, so this is This is my perspective. So your perspective, Israel. So this is my perspective, Israel. Your perspective, Israel, Macedonia. Right? Up through Syria and across into Macedonia. So that's where he's from.
Now that would be like modern day, like Balkans
Istanbul.
Turkey.
area. Yeah, the Balkans.
Turkey.
No, I think Macedonia is still its own place.
Onesimus, or Onesimus, he appears 2 times in the scripture, once here in Colossians and once in Philemon. He's identified as this Christian that's traveling with Paul. Aristarchus, he's at Caesarea. He leaves with Paul. You know where Caesarea is? You guys from Israel know where this is. Caesarea Maritima, right? On the coast, right down the coast from southern on the coast from Tel Aviv. Yeah, right? It's at the modern day Tel Aviv. It's down the coast. It's a big port city. So if you came into Israel, you would come into this city in Judea. He was on the trip, on one of the mission trips with Paul. The other one is he mentions Mark. Some of you may recognize this because we're studying the book of Acts on Friday nights. This is the only place I know that it identifies this Mark as Barnabas' cousin. But this is the Mark who, on the original mission trip with Paul, he bolts on the mission trip. He leaves before the persecution begins. Now, mind you want to catch how cool this is, because in Acts 13, Mark abandons the mission trip. In Acts 15, Barnabas wants them to go on the second mission trip they're going to leave on in Acts 16, and Paul says he can't come with us. He bolted the first time. Paul is angry at it, and it causes a split between Barnabas and Paul. And here, later on at the end of Paul's life, when he's in prison in Rome, he's like, you should take that guy Mark with you. He's a good guy. Right? So it's a restoration. So that's pretty.
Talking about grace too.
He's talking about grace, right? So I'm trying to connect those dots very quickly for you. Like, as you study the Bible over the years and these things start becoming part of your DNA, you'll see the connections, right? They're pretty easy to see. You say, oh yeah, that's that Mark. He's over here. And wow, in Colossians, he's writing about that same guy, but you have to know when this is happening. Colossians is written way, way after the events of Acts, right? It's written at the end of his life. The end of the book of Acts ends with Paul arriving in Rome for prison. That's when the book of Acts ends. Colossians is written after that event, sometime from that prison in Rome. All right, you got it? And then this guy, Epaphras, that he talks about in 4:12 to 13, he's Paul's connection to Colossae, because Paul knows this guy, and this guy is from that city. That's probably why he's writing a letter to this city. All right, so that's kind of the connection. And the great prayer is the prayer for this guy, which I love, in verse. What does he say it? That you may stand perfect. Listen to this. I wish I could say this for all of you. You should say, I want this prayer over my life. That you may stand perfect and complete in the will of God. You know, you will never have a feeling of unfulfillment in your entire life if you're doing this.
Amen.
It doesn't matter what you earn, what your title is, where you wind up, what house you live in, what car you drive, what prison you're raiding from. If you stand perfect and complete in the will of God, you'll be thoroughly joyful. Then he mentions Luke, the beloved physician. Of course, this is Luke, the writer of the Gospel of Luke. And what else? It's a major writer of the New Testament. What else did Luke write?
Acts.
The book of Acts. Yes, he wrote the book of Acts. Luke is Luke.
You haven't got it.
Acts is a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. We got that, right? Demas, he mentions Demas. He appears a couple of times in Paul's ministry. And then Nympha, very interestingly, most scholars believe that this is a woman, which in early translations of the Bible was a little bit more male-centric, and they kind of ignored the feminine, because it could be a male or feminine. Anyway, she's hosting a home church in Laodicea, right? Okay, finally, right? Finally, we can kind of like start landing the plane, because it's really only a few other concepts that we need to see here. The big theological points we've covered, right? He says this, very interestingly. He says, now, when this epistle is read among you, who's he writing this to? Anybody, again? The Colossians, right? He's sending this letter to that city. Colossians is a city in Asia. Colossae is a city in Asia, where those other 7 cities that we see, like Ephesus and so on, Thyatira, these cities of Revelation that God had a lot to say about. He says this, when you read this letter, and you also read the letter to the church of the Laodiceans. You know what's interesting? There's no letter in the New Testament to the Laodiceans. It doesn't exist. We don't have any record of it. But clearly Paul wrote it. Maybe if we had one, it would be part of this New Testament. We don't have it. We don't know what it says. But he does say this. He references it. Hey, when you get this letter, share it with the Laodiceans. I've told them to do the same. When they get their letter, these cities are very close to one another. Share it with them. Share it with each other. So that's very, very interesting. And then he says this thing to Rippus. It says this, another prayer for all of you. Take heed to the ministry which you have received from the Lord, that you may fulfill it. Don't you love that? Take heed to the ministry that you may fulfill it. I think last night I said, because we're studying this journey that Paul is on, all of you who identify with Christ, Yeshua the Messiah, are in ministry in some way. It doesn't matter if it's formal ministry. How does it show up here in this letter? Pay attention to how you look to those that are watching. That's a ministry to the world. Every choice you make, everything you do, the world is watching. Grandma's watching, parents are watching, friends are watching, people are all watching. And you want it to look a certain way. Isn't that amazing? And then, we'll close with this. He just says, hey, do me a favor. When all's said and done, remember my chains. Amen. He's remembered, like this guy, if you think about what he's gone through in his ministry, we've been studying this a lot on Friday nights. I mean, he goes from one city to the next, lied about, beaten, arrested, and one city in Philippi, also a city in Macedonia. He is stoned to the point where they thought they had killed him. By the way, the purpose of stoning was to kill someone. They didn't stone someone just to make them suffer. They stoned the person to kill them. They thought they killed him, and they threw him outside the city in a heap, but he wasn't dead. And when all the stoners were gone, he got up. Stoners. When they got up, when they left, he got up and went back into the city, got cleaned up, went into the next city the next day and started preaching.
Maybe that's why they got the munchies and they
Yeah, stoners, yeah. Anyway, all that to say, we have to remember the suffering that he went through. So he says that, remember the chains. So those of us who are going to join us, okay, next week I won't be teaching, some others will be teaching, but when I teach again, the next book you could start reading ahead is going to be 1 Thessalonians. Thessalonica, yes, that's another city. Disciples, you know what the title is going to be, very likely? Disciples doing what disciples do.
Disciples.